Hey guys, this is the Bishop with Radio Rothbard. Thank you for listening to Radio Rothbard. Always great to hear from our fans out there. And I wanted to let you guys know that we are still in our year-end fundraising drive. Yes, 2024 has flown by. We are excited for big things in 2025, but we need help from people like you. We have no billionaire donors. We certainly receive no government money. We are only supported by people that care about the mission of the Mises Institute. You can donate today throughout the end of the year at Mises.org/Radio Rothbard 24. You donate $25 or more, you'll get a copy of Tom DiLorenzo's newest booklet, The Axis of Evil, America's Three Worst Presidents. Again, thank you for being a listener throughout this year. Have a very Merry Christmas, and we'll see you in 2025.
Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken, executive editor at the Mises Institute. And joining me today is Tom DiLorenzo, our president here at the Mises Institute. And if you don't already know, of course, Tom's been, before he was president, he was a senior fellow for decades and has been, in many ways, our go-to guy on tariffs. And so we're going to talk a little bit about tariffs today because in spite of I don't know, the hundreds, maybe thousands of articles we have published on Mises.org over the last nearly 30 years. We apparently still have a long way to go when it comes to people understanding tariffs and how they work and their nature as taxes, their coercive nature, all of that stuff. Because I think the rise of Trump has contributed a bit to a lot of confusion over it, and a lot of people, because of political allegiances, have decided that tariffs aren't that bad. So we'll just talk about some of the fundamentals involved there. Now, before we get to that, I just want to make sure a couple of things going on at the Mises Institute. If you have not ever subscribed to the Mises Institute website, to our daily or weekly emails, you don't have to get a daily one. If that's too much, you can get a weekly one. And that'll just keep you updated on the podcasts, on the articles, on the upcoming events, all of that. All you need to do for that is go to Mises.org, MISES.org, and click at the top under subscribe. And if you're really motivated, right next to that, it says become a member. And you can click on that. And for your one-time gift of $100 or more, or a recurring donation of $9, that makes you a 2025 member, which you'll get, of course, all sorts of updates on events, as well as our print publication and other invitations. So head on over to Mises.org if you have just a minute. Now, Tom, I just continue to see, and I'll basically just ask you questions along these lines, continue to see just ongoing confusion about tariffs. And I can tell you that when I am out in among a broader audience, say when the Mises Institute might be present at other events that aren't strictly Mises events, that people will come by our table or booth and strike up a debate with me about tariffs. And it's amazing the theories people have about tariffs and about how they're really not a tax, they're really not a problem economically. It's pretty common, I would say, for this to happen, at least in recent years. It didn't come up nearly as much prior to Trump. But one thing, and so I've just got a series of questions here for you to help us clarify these issues. And one thing that I noticed that comes up historically and is relevant to your most recent article for us, which came out on the 26th, and this was an article called Our History of Protectionist Tariff Train Wrecks. And I think this is a good starting point. It offers some historical analysis, but the key adjective, I think, in the title there is protectionist tariff train wrecks. And these are two different things you could be discussing, right? We could be talking about revenue tariffs, or we could be talking about protectionist tariffs. In policy, those things, they have different motivations and different outcomes and manifest themselves differently. But I think if we're just going to continue along those lines, maybe a good place to start is just to have you clarify the difference between a protectionist tariff and a revenue tariff. Maybe in terms of economic analysis, there's not a difference, but in application, there's a real difference, right?
Yeah, right. Well, at the beginning of the American Republic, tariffs were constitutional, and we didn't get an income tax until 1913. And so at the beginning of the Republic, a revenue tariff was just a low tariff of maybe 10%. And it wasn't enough to really significantly deter competition from abroad. Its purpose was to raise enough funds to finance the constitutional functions of government. But then, of course, once that was available, beginning in the 1820s, if not sooner, protectionists who wanted protection from competition started pushing for protectionist tariffs, 40, 50, 60% on average. And they one of the first big victories was in 1824, and they pushed the average tariff rate up to around 45%. And then that means that some things had like woolen blankets would have had like 100% tariff. And so if somebody from England is shipping woolen blankets to America and they have to pay 100% tariff, the American manufacturer of woolen blankets can raise his price by, say, 80 or 90% and still outcompete the guy from England. And so everybody's prices go up. And there's an old saying that what protectionist tariffs protect us from is lower prices. And that's when this all started. And so all throughout the 19th century, that was one of the big economic debates. And unfortunately, Donald Trump is on the wrong side of it. When he was president the first time, his first economic speech, he went to Lexington, Kentucky, because that's where Henry Clay was from. And Henry Clay was a big 19th century proponent of protectionist tariffs. And he called his program the American System. And so Trump apparently thought, well, he likes to say, America first, make America great. And so, but he didn't seem to have an understanding of even Econ 101 about tariffs, because Henry Clay himself was a large slave plantation owning hemp grower, and he wanted protectionist tariffs on hemp coming in from abroad. He actually said that's what got him into politics in the first place. He wanted to be able to put high tariffs on to kill the competition for his hemp that he was growing on his slave plantation in Kentucky. And so and so Trump thinks that's great. Well, that's not good for Americans. That might have been good for Henry Clay, but it's bad for people who buy the products for sure. And fast forward to today, if Trump puts higher tariffs on steel, well, yeah, that'll temporarily help out the steel workers in the steel industry, but it'll harm the car industry. We use a lot of steel to make cars, so it'll make the American car industry less competitive on international markets. And basically, protectionist tariffs they protect us from lower prices. It's against your self-interest. It's against my self-interest. But for hundreds of years, propagandists and publicists for the protectionists have beat this drum of trying to convince us that things that are against our own self-interest are really in our self-interest. And they've been pretty successful at it. And they usually appeal to xenophobia, or China is going to invade America or something like that. And people tend to become dumb when they become fearful of a foreign invasion, even if it's an economic invasion and not a military invasion.
Well, and also from a revenue tariff standpoint, right, you could see how that would be just a totally different argument, right? Because now we're constantly seeing the two things mixed together, right? Where, okay, we've got Trump coming in and saying, I'm going to abolish the income tax and replace it with the revenue, with a tariff. Okay, well, he's arguing in that case for a revenue tariff. Now, I don't know who actually believes that he's going to abolish the income tax. We do know that he'll raise tariffs and then maybe get around later to getting rid of the income tax. Seems to be the order of operations that they're planning on, which, of course, is terrible. Get rid of the income tax first, and then I can talk about tariffs. Fine.
Yes.
But revenue tariffs, right? There's a certain motivation to keep them low enough that people continue to buy imports, right? Because if you just raise it to 100%, people will stop buying the imports, and then you're not getting any of the revenue. So the federal government would have a motivation to keep revenue tariffs at a reasonable level, right?
Yeah, right. Well, unless they're, it's all a matter of who's bribing who, if because the industries that want the 100% tariffs, if they pour enough millions into the coffers of the Democrat and Republican parties, well, they might think, well, we can always print money. We'll lose a little bit of tariff revenue, but we'll just get the Fed to print more money for us, and we'll do it that way. And
so, of course, there's not like a bright, shining line between a revenue and a protectionist tariff.
And when you think about it, think about war. What do countries do to each other when they go to war? Well, they try to impose a blockade. They try to starve the economy of the enemy. And so in the American Civil War, for example, one of the very first things Abraham Lincoln did was to commence a blockade of the southern ports to try to starve the southern economy. And the same is true of World War I, World War II, attempts at blockades. So basically, with protectionist tariffs, we do to ourselves in peacetime what our enemies would like to do to us in wartime, starving our own economy. And so it's this bombardment of propaganda that actually convinces millions of Americans that things that are against their self-interest are really in their self-interest. It's very Orwellian.
I'd forgotten about that argument, right? That if the argument that cutting down on imports is good for your economy, well, then the Confederate economy should have gone gangbusters, right?
They should have won the war in about 2 months.
Because they couldn't import anything and ruin their local economy. So the fact that an embargo is an act of war, right? The Germans should have been just fat and comfortable after the starvation blockade was imposed on Germany in World War I. That would seem to contradict the idea that imports are bad for your economy, and which I think brings us to an important issue here that which probably is foundational as well, is I continue to see headlines that they're phrased in a way where it says, well, Trump plans to raise tariffs, but he plans to cut taxes, or how tariffs are different from taxes. These are like actual headlines I've seen. Well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't a tariff just a tax?
Well, sure it is. That's why we have customs houses. If you go in, ship goods into, say, Charleston, South Carolina, you can see the old customs house right there on the water in Charleston Harbor. I'm not sure. I don't think it's in use anymore. It's like a museum. But the real customs house is still there. You got to pay a tariff. The Port of Baltimore, you got to pay tariffs on things that are where there are tariffs imposed on things. And so it's a tax. Yeah, it'd be more clear if we just called it the tariff tax and not just tariff, because that's kind of a weird word. And the people who are not economically educated, they don't know what that is. But yeah, of course it's a tax. If it's collected by the government, it's a tax.
Well, it is, and by force, right? It's not like they're optional.
That's right.
If you want to buy those goods.
That's right.
Now, I mean, the very same people who tell me in many cases, right, you'll see all this at the time in domestic politics, right? Oh, some government, state government, local government, federal government, whoever, they want to impose a sales tax on a good. So when you purchase that, the merchant has to collect, the merchant is responsible for paying that tax. So they collect an additional sales tax from you. And what is often argued is, oh, well, the sales tax is just passed on to the consumer. And so we shouldn't have sales taxes because the consumer just ends up paying for it. And which actually isn't totally true. Right, the tax is partially passed on, but are also partially paid. I mean, at least that's what we were taught in principles of econ.
Yeah.
And but then these exact same people will say, oh, well, if you impose a tax on imports, which strikes me as a type of sales tax, it's a transactional tax on a sale, they don't say, oh, the consumer, that is the American side of the transaction, it just gets passed on to the Americans. No, they then tell me the opposite. They then tell me that the Chinese pay the full brunt of the tariff. Right? It should apply in both cases, right? Right?
Yeah,
They're
right.
passing on a large part of that just to the American consumer.
Of course it does. Yeah, they can't pass on all of it, but they have to eat a good bit of it. And another thing that happens is, when the price goes up, which they always do, that's the whole purpose of protectionist tariffs, to raise prices. The law of demand says people will consume less of whatever it is. And so we do without. A lot of people just do without because they can't afford it. Or if they can't afford it, they just choose not to have it for whatever, because it's too expensive. They don't need it. And so the economists call that a deadweight loss. It's kind of a clunky economics term. But the way to think about it is, we have to do without. It sort of reduces our standard of living. When they say inflation is a measure of the standard of living, well, yeah, that's you can't afford as much stuff in your life if everything gets more expensive, and tariffs make certain things more expensive for you.
Now, some will argue then that that's okay because it encourages more people to then save. You'll even get people in our corner of things, right, saying is that, well, if you got to have a tax, sales tax is better, so tariffs better than other types of taxes. I guess I kind of see where they're coming from, but to really make a judgment about that, aren't you engaging in a type of central planning then? Right, because what you're saying is that, okay, you've got all these goods and services, which small business people may be using to build their companies and essentially build capital, but we're saying, it's okay to tax those. It just seems that there's this common misconception that tariffs are only imposed on end product goods, right? Like, people won't be able to buy this Chinese junk. But what if I'm buying stuff for my small business that I need to build things?
Oh, yeah, the capital goods. The majority of tariffs actually are on so-called inputs, things that are used to produce other products. Like I mentioned steel earlier. With a tariff on steel is used to produce a million different things. So all those things will be more costly to produce. And that can hurt your bottom line if you're in business, and the consumers have to pay more if the price goes up. And that's true. There are many thousands of things that have tariffs on them over the years that have had tariffs on them that are inputs into the production process of the final goods. And so, like in the late 19th century, when we had high tariffs in a 50% range after the Civil War, that was a big hindrance to the Industrial Revolution, because even if foreign trade accounted for maybe 10% or less of the whole economy, but still a lot of the inputs and a lot of the capital goods that were being taxed with a tariff tax made it harder for American companies to compete back then. And so a lot of people make, Pat Buchanan used to be famous for making the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy argument that high tariffs existed. America prospered in about the 30 or 40 years after the Civil War economically. Therefore, the tariffs caused the prosperity. That's like saying the rooster crows in the morning, the sun comes up in the morning. Therefore, the rooster crowing causes the sun to come up. But that's a fallacy.
Well, the other classic example would be that ice cream sales cause homicides, right? Because there's more homicides in the summer. And that was essentially going to be my next question is we see that all the time. When I'm sure you get the same emails if you write an article on tariffs, America had high tariffs in the 19th century, and that's when America was really prosperous. The classic correlation must mean causation argument. Yeah. But not mentioned, of course, is that the United States had no income tax in that period. The regulatory state was virtually non-existent. The first three-letter agency came in I think the 1880s with the railroad regulation, or the 1870s perhaps.
1887.
Okay, so
the
nothing.
Interstate Commerce Commission. Yeah.
There was nothing before that in terms of federal regulation. So I'm supposed to believe that it was the tariffs that drove all that regulation. I guess we should just say, well, get rid of federal regulation. Hey guys, you can even still have state regulation if you want. Get rid of that, get rid of the income tax, and hey, then you can raise tariffs, and then we'll see how prosperous we are. Maybe we'll be. But again, that's different from arguing that the tariffs caused the prosperity.
Yeah, that's foolish. It's economically ignorant, and it's ahistorical as well.
Well, I mean, another aspect of the tariff thing, of course, is that he's using it as foreign policy. Trump is. And we've seen this a couple of times just in recent weeks. So there's all these different arguments, right? We've of course said that there's no economic argument in favor of tariffs. Because, boy, we can slap those down all day in terms of very good economic theory. Those are the easy ones, I think, in terms of at least building an argument. However, people will come back with more speculative arguments. These are the political arguments, the national defense arguments, such as, we have to produce all of our own steel because then a enemy, whoever that might be, would cut us off from steel. We wouldn't be able to buy warships or build warships, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I've argued against that, too. And even the Pentagon has said the U.S. doesn't need to worry about its sources of steel. There are many such sources, and they're not tied to China. Nevertheless, people continue along with these political arguments. And now Trump very innovatively is coming up with other ways to use tariffs, just basically as a foreign policy threat involving all sorts of things, one of which is, hey, Mexico, stop immigrants from making it to the northern border, or I'll slap 100% tariff on all of your goods that might go to the U.S. And I'm sure he's coming up with other things as well that he can say, hey, just take orders from the United States, or we're going to slap huge tariffs on them. I mean, essentially, though, I'm at a loss for the way Americans are willing to accept this so easily. Is that right? Because what he's saying is, hey, America, I'm going to double the cost of, hey, small businessman, I'm going to double the cost of your goods that you need to import in order to make your stuff until Mexico does what I say. I mean, I guess checkmate to Trump, because I can see how politically popular this position could be. But I guess it's only popular because people don't see that tariffs are essentially a tax on them. But I'm impressed with it from a political standpoint.
Yeah, it's a slick political maneuver. Like I said earlier, people tend to become dumb when politicians start talking about patriotism and waving the flag. It's kind of like one of the things that in the famous essay, War is the Health of the State by Randolph Bourne, is that once the government declares that there's an enemy plotting to attack us, people become childlike, and they want mommy and daddy to protect them. And in that case, mommy and daddy is the government. And I think we have some of that goes on when we have presidents talking about the foreign threat over the border from economic threat, not necessarily a military threat. And as far as the argument that we need protectionism so that we can produce steel in wartime, well, I grew up in western Pennsylvania, north of Pittsburgh, in the 1960s and 70s, right in the middle of the decline of the steel industry, and it was the heavily protected steel industry. And the reason why it was declined, and the same with cars, was it was so heavily protected. You protect businesses from competition, they become fat and lazy. And that's what happened to the steel industry, and that was happening to the car industry. And so without competition, and when the unions wanted a $1 an hour raise every year for the next 3 years, the companies just said, sure, no problem. We don't have any competition to speak of, so we'll give you the raise. And no strike, so you don't avoid a strike. Year after year you do that, then all of a sudden the Japanese show up and clean their clocks with as far as competition. So if you want to be prepared for national defense purposes, you want to subject your industries to competition. You don't want to protect them from competition. And I would argue you would want low tariffs or no tariffs, and not the opposite. And of course Trump seems to assume that no other countries are not going to retaliate. They have no ability to retaliate. He can just walk around there and bluster and threaten. But, the lesson of the famous Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 is that a dozen other countries immediately slapped very heavy tariffs on American products. And so in the next 3 years, world trade, the international trade across the world, shrunk by 80% because of an international trade war. And I'm not saying that Trump's tariffs on Mexico will do the same thing like that, but they could spot, Mexico can retaliate, and he's also threatened Canada. So Mexico and Canada could both retaliate. They don't need to necessarily sit back and take it because he's Donald Trump, as far as that's concerned.
Well, it seems like a weird strategy to make it as difficult as possible to do business with Americans and to act like that's in our interest. And that can be seen also in the BRICS threat, right? So these BRICS people who are getting together and they're trying to create an alternative to the dollar, which I don't think is imminent, but it's a longer term geopolitical project that they've got going. And they're trying to create some sort of alternative to the dollar, and Trump turns around and says, well, I'm going to slap huge tariffs on all you BRICS countries if you do anything to try and diminish the influence of the dollar. This, yet again, I'm going to make it as difficult as possible. I'm going to put anyone who does business with the United States under threat, and this is the same way with U.S. sanctions, right, is anyone who uses the American-dominated SWIFT system, anyone who uses the dollar. We reserve the right to steal all of your deposits like we did with Russia and do whatever we want with them. All he's doing is telling the world, don't use dollars, don't trade with the United States. And in the short term, you're not going to see much of a distinction. And I guess if you're serving a 4-year presidential term, then that's probably not going to be a problem. But if the U.S. just keeps saying, hey, trading with us, using our currency, we're just going to use that as leverage against you to accomplish political ends. That is so the opposite of the old Washington doctrine of just, hey, have friendly market relations with everybody and don't get involved in their politics. Trump's like the opposite of that, where I'm going to use tariffs to impose my dollar policy, my trade policy on everybody, and it's hard to see why that wouldn't have longer term repercussions. But again, I guess it can be very, very popular politically. And also, Trump can just do this seemingly without any intervention from the rest of the federal government. I saw that recently Trump's coming in, he's talking about, I'm going to do this with tariffs, I'm going to do that with tariffs, because apparently the president can, due to convention. Obviously, the Constitution does not allow this. The Constitution says that the Congress shall have total control of all imposts, duties, taxes, etc. And I don't know if you know the history of it. I have not looked this up. At what point the president just started deciding that he could just set tariff rates however he felt like it. But that seems to be where we are now. And then shockingly, I saw Rand Paul, to his credit, gets up and says, hey, I think we should pass legislation in Congress saying that presidents can't just impose taxes on imports whenever and wherever they feel like it. And he was attacked. Rand was attacked all over the place by MAGA people for hating America, essentially, because Rand wanted to, stick to the U.S. Constitution on that aspect. So it's just amazing what these Trump supporters are saying. Screw the Constitution, just support Trump so he can impose more taxes. It's very bizarre.
Yeah, it's because of the rise of these so-called executive orders. And that probably, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I'm guessing that that probably ballooned out during the Lyndon Johnson years, executive orders, because we had a war going on. And so in the last 60 or 70 years, you've had this accumulation of these executive orders, which is pretty much saying the Constitution doesn't matter. And so that's where we are. You might remember one of Clinton's flunkies once said something like, stroke of the pen, law of the land. Pretty neat. I forget who that was that said it. I think it was one of Clinton's people. Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, stroke of the pen, law of the land. Who needs a legislature if you can do that? And then there's the czars. I've been reading that Trump is already appointing czars, new czars. When I was one of my courses that I used to teach, I used to put up on the screen in the classroom a list of this online list of all the czars, and we have like a salmon fishery czar, and you know, everything under the sun. There's a czar now, and these people don't have to go through the Senate confirmation process. They're given sort of mini dictatorial powers to do whatever the president wants. So he uses that. He'll probably have a tariff czar. I don't think there is a tariff czar yet.
Do you know when did you notice that we were using this word czar to refer to basically these government agents? Because it seems weird to me that you would want to name an American government office after like a despotic Russian monarch. So I don't know when that started.
Yeah, well, they you know, the people in Washington like the idea of being a despotic monarch. But they want to be despotic American monarchs, and probably, you know, I've looked this up. You can look it up on the web, czars, and you can find. They'll tell you when they started. I think probably in the 1960s they started really proliferating of all these czars.
It's just one of those times that the true nature of American politics peeks through the veil, I suppose. As we're calling ourselves czar. I mean, why not? Why not make it the Tariff Führer? Maybe that would be more appropriate.
Well, I was disappointed when they called it the Department of Homeland Security and not the Department of Fatherland Security. I thought that would have been more accurate.
Yes, and of course the outcome is exactly what we expected from that department. But no talk about abolishing that. But I just think it's very remarkable where we are in terms of talking about raising taxes. And any talk about Trump as a tax cutter just really is kind of a joke as long as we're talking about raising taxes on imports. And yet it seems that a lot of his supporters are continuing to push that narrative that he's a tax cutter. And remember that it seems to me all of these new tariffs that he's talking about are on top of essentially his tariffs from the first term, because Biden really didn't do anything about the Trump tariff. So we're now going on. We're going to be looking at 12 years of pretty significant tariff increases.
Yeah, I guess these people are all graduates of Trump University. Didn't he have some Trump University? They got sued and he had to pay a lot of money, a big fine, because it was sort of a bogus paper mill, diploma mill type of thing. And maybe that's where they got their economic education.
Well, and of course, here at as I've said in a lot of our meetings about editorial policies and stuff, is just like it's very hard to win on the tariff issue because if you on certain things, anytime we say anything nice about Trump, we're then accused of being like crazed MAGA cultists, and then we turn around and we might criticize some economic policy of Trump and we say, hey, tariffs are bad. Then we get a showering of emails from people talking about how we all have Trump derangement syndrome. So it's, we can't win on the tariff issue, but the fact of the matter is we're not going to change. Our position on tariffs has been the same for 40 plus years. Because the reality of tariffs hasn't changed. We're against tax increases at the Mises Institute, but it's amazing how many people that seem confused by that.
Conservatives.
Right, no less. People who tell me how they're against big government come on and tell me why we should need tax increases. But again, abolish the income tax and then come back and we can start to negotiate about what the what your tariffs can be. But no one's really talking about doing that crucial step first. Yeah. So, and one friend of mine, he said really that he thinks that the discussion about replacing the income tax with tariffs and holding out tariffs as the substitute for income taxes is really just a tactic to get people to think more kindly toward tariffs, right? There's no plan to get rid of the income tax in any meaningful way. It's just a way to speak more favorably about tariffs and to get people more accepting of the idea. And I think he's probably right.
Yeah, well, we have a history of replacing tariffs with the income tax and vice versa. We had an income tax temporarily during the Civil War, and it was ended, and so we went back to tariffs, raising most of the money. And tariffs have historically been most harmful to farmers, disproportionately harmful to farmers, because if our trading partners overseas become impoverished by protectionist tariffs, they don't have enough dollars or as many dollars to buy American goods. And what are they buying? They're buying a lot of agricultural goods, exports from America. And so farmers have always known, even in the 19th century, and all my studying that era of his economic history, is even if they were unschooled, literally going to school and learning economics, they understood that whenever the tariffs were jacked up, their business in Europe dried up, and they lost a lot of money. And that happened after the Civil War, when we had these high tariffs in the 55-60% range on average. And the farm lobby became more and more powerful, and they struck a deal. The advocates of the income tax struck a deal with the farmers, saying, we'll cut the average tariff rate down to something more reasonable, maybe 18 or 20%, if you, the farmers, politically support an income tax. And the income tax is only going to be on the rich people anyway. The top rate originally was 7%, but you had to make $500,000 in 1913 to pay 7%. So the farmers bit, they went for it. And so by the time you get to, that's 1913, by the time you get to 1920, and World War II is ended, the top income tax rate was 77%, and shortly thereafter, the tariff rate went up. In 1929, the average tariff rate went up to about 60% because of the Smoot-Hawley tariff. So the farmers ended up with a much higher income tax rate than they thought they were going to get, and high tariffs after that whole incident. And that's what will happen again if we don't do, like you said, abolish the income tax first, and then we can talk about tariffs.
Yeah, in the history of political bait and switches, that's one of the most horrible. So we'll go ahead and wrap up with that for this episode of Radio Rothbard. Thank you, Tom, for joining me today. We'll be back more next week, and we'll see you next time.